There's some troubling information coming out of South Korea on the horrific JeJu AIrlines crash that killed 179 people. Let's get into it in this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. In this report, we're going to talk about some information we're getting out of South Korea that has huge implications on the JeJu AIrlines Flight 7C-2216 crash at Muan International Airport on December 29th, 2024. We'll also talk about why the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, and the flight data recorder, the FDR, stopped recording, and news about a former executive of the Korea Airports Corporation who was found dead in his residence. And we've got a report from someone in South Korea that, if true, has some big implications. Before we get into that, I want to say that the news reporting we're doing on this ongoing investigation is based on official authority press releases, eyewitness accounts, evidence, everything that's readily available. We're not speculating about what happened, but reporting on what we know and what we've found so far. And why is this important? Well, people and organizations, including state media, have, a dog in the hunt that might color the information coming out, or in the extreme cases, change or suppress the information and data. But for the safety of future flights and for the families of victims, we all need to know what happened accurately. And here's what we do know. As previously reported here on Taking Off, JeJu Air Flight 7C-2216 was a scheduled international passenger flight from Bangkok, Thailand to Muan International Airport in South Korea. On December 29, 2024, the Boeing 737-800 aircraft carrying 175 passengers and 6 crew members reportedly experienced a bird strike while on final approach into Muan International Airport. The pilots declared a mayday and executed a go-around, then attempted to land, coming back the opposite direction. The landing gear was not deployed during this second attempted landing. Unfortunately, the aircraft overran the runway and collided with a concrete structure supporting the ILS localizer antenna, resulting in a catastrophic fire. Tragically, 179 individuals lost their lives, 2 survived, making it the deadliest aviation disaster on South Korean soil. The 2 surviving crew members were seated in the rear of the plane, which detached from the fuselage upon impact. One was a 33-year-old male flight attendant. When he regained consciousness, he had no recollection of the crash. He's being treated for multiple fractures and is under special care due to the risk of paralysis. The other survivor, 25-year-old female flight attendant, is stable, having suffered injuries to her ankle and head. And that's all we know about the survivors at the moment. In a significant development, investigators have confirmed the presence of bird feathers and blood in both engines. While bird strikes are common in airliners, the engines are designed to handle birds coming in all the time. It's unclear at this point how much damage to the engines was created by these particular birds. But here are some hard numbers. The last ADS-B point that we had was 1.44 miles from the end of the runway. The 737 was on a stable approach. The heading was 360 at 144 knots at 1,375 feet. 4 minutes later, the airplane impacted the localizer array at 160 knots, going the other way. There's no way on short final that they lose both engines and have that result. It's physics. You can trade altitude for airspeed if you lose thrust, but in that last known configuration, there's very little airspeed and altitude, so it had to have thrust. Okay, that's one thing. One report we're getting out of South Korea is that the Boeing 737 on final approach to Muan Airport was indeed configured for landing, that the flaps and the gear were actually in the down and locked position. If this report is accurate, it has some serious implications that we'll get into in a moment. And I want to stress we don't know if it's accurate. It's possible that the flight crew initiated a go-around before dropping gear and before the bird strike. When the tower cautioned birds, maybe the flight crew saw a large flock and hit the go-around button. And as we get more data, hopefully we'll be able to determine if this is true or not, because it makes a huge difference. Standard procedures for the 737 in the U.S., after talking to 5 different 737 pilots, is that the plane is totally configured for landing just before passing the outer marker or the final approach fix, which is between 4 to 7 miles from the runway. One U.S. 737 pilot mentioned decades back it was the flight crew's decision and you could wait to be configured at 500 feet AGL. But that changed years ago. We do know from the video taken on the ground of the stricken 737 flying overhead showing a puff of flame and smoke coming out of engine 2 or the right engine, the gear appears to be in the up position. The final approach to runway 01, the first approach where they hit the birds, is flown over water. The footage from the ground could not have been during this phase of flight. The video clip was taken most likely during the go-around after it passed the airport. Our source in South Korea, wishing to remain anonymous, reports that the gear was down, and on decision to go around, they retracted the gear. Why is this news, if accurate, so critical? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But before, let's get to another big news story concerning the crash. Sun Chang-won, the former president of the Korea Airports Corporation, the KAC, was found dead at his residence in Gunpo, Gyeonggi Province on January 21, 2025. Several reports out of South Korea indicate Sun possibly took his own life, even though noting the absence of any kind of message left behind. It's also being reported no signs of foul play. The Korea Airports Corporation is a public corporation responsible for the management, operation, and development of most of the country's airports, 14, including regional airports and several smaller airports, with the exception being the big Incheon International Airport. The KAC manages everything from air traffic control, ground handling, security, and passenger services to maintenance. Sun led the KAC from December 2018 to February 2022, a tenure that included the 2020 renovation of Muan International Airport's localizer. This localizer's reinforced concrete structure has been scrutinized following the JeJu Air flight accident. The localizer antenna array was constructed with a concrete base on an elevated mound, and this setup was intended to adjust for the slope at the end of the runway, elevating the instrument landing system, the ILS antenna, to ensure an adequate signal in compliance with the ICAO requirements, the international standards for aviation. The structure was built on a mound approximately 13 feet tall, with the concrete estimated to be 3 feet thick. This design has been criticized for not adhering to the international standards which recommend that objects or facilities near the runway safety area should be made of frangible materials that would break or deform upon impact to minimize damage to aircraft. Despite his role during the renovation, Sun was not under investigation at the time of his death. One note about the localizer structure: it was located 656 feet from the end of the runway. That distance from the stop end of the runway wasn't really the problem. The plane impacted around 160 knots. Another 100 feet or two wouldn't have changed the outcome. The issue was the height above ground. At 13 feet and a thick concrete support structure, most airports it's a few feet high at the most, and the antennas are frangible, designed to easily break away at any impact. The airport design is undoubtedly something investigators are looking at, and was something that Sun oversaw during his time as the head of the KAC. With Sun's death, we spoke with a South Korean source who wished to remain anonymous. The South Korean culture does view the taking of one's life similar to other Asian cultures. For instance, Japan is famous for the seppuku or harikari, the ritual action. While South Korea doesn't practice that particular ritual, they do have the 4th highest suicide rate in the world per capita. It's a sad statistic, to be sure. Muan International Airport, built in 2007, serves as a vital transportation hub for the region, which has long been in need of such infrastructure. However, the airport's location has brought its share of challenges. Again, talking to South Korean sources, the airport is situated along migratory routes for birds. It faces a heightened risk of bird strikes, which pose serious safety concerns for aviation. And when you look at this chart that South Korean pilots use, you see the airport is surrounded by areas of heavy bird feeding and roosting areas. There are an abundance of migratory birds, and the greater white-fronted goose is known to be present in large numbers. And to those not airline pilots or not understanding, birds are ingested in the airline engines all the time. The engines are made to ingest them and spit them out without causing any damage. The Miracle on the Hudson, Sully, where the Airbus had both engines knocked out, that's a lottery odds type of event, and it happened with very large birds. And I just want to make sure that that's clear. Before Muan Airport's construction, disputes over land acquisition created significant delays, reflecting the tension surrounding the project. Additionally, the airport often contends with dense fog, particularly during the winter months, complicating visibility and flight operations. Our source, who is familiar with JeJu Airlines policy and procedures, stated that they were surprised when the accident occurred, noting that JeJu was actually one of the safer airlines in South Korea. We were shown some training materials and discovered JeJu airline pilots, like U.S. and other airline basic procedures, were trained to continue an approach and land if they experienced a bird strike or loss of power while on final approach. So why did the pilots then make the decision to go around? And when did they make that decision? To find out more about what actually happened, the investigators would like to look at the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. However, South Korean authorities are reporting almost 4 minutes of the data is missing from both of these devices, the final 4 minutes of the flight, the 4 minutes of the emergency, the 4 minutes that would answer a whole lot of these questions. Their words are that the final 4 minutes were not even recorded, possibly due to a complete electrical failure. Yet we know the radios worked during the final 4 minutes. How is it possible that the CVR and the FDR stopped recording on a Boeing 737-800? As we mentioned in the previous report, the FAA required all airliners to have an alternative power source in 2003, so that if the airplane lost power in the engines, batteries or some other alternate power source would continue to operate critical systems like the radios, the instruments, and the CVR and the FDR. This plane was built in 2009 by Boeing and delivered to Ryanair, which we'll get to in a moment. But it's always possible that Ryanair did not adhere to the FAA requirements on the alternative power source for the CVR and FDR. But talking to 737 pilots, I had one said, I cannot imagine Boeing delivering a non-compliant aircraft. According to South Korea reports, after the crash, the FDR was first inspected by the Aviation and Railway Accident Investigation Board, the ARAIB, which is under the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport. However, after finding the data missing, the FDR was sent to Washington to the NTSB, and we're waiting for the NTSB to report their findings. The CVR has remained in South Korea as far as we know. Questions began to swirl as to what would cause the data to be missing. Would a power loss cause the CVR to stop recording? And again, speaking to the 737-800 pilots with the question, what event could cause the alternative power source required to power the CVR and FDR to stop? And no 737 pilot could think of any event that would cause this, certainly not a bird strike. One pilot even added that a bird strike is well within the requirements to still be able to record the CVR and FDR. Remember, the aircraft has been reported established on final, possibly geared down when the bird strike occurred. And I'm hoping that the answers are forthcoming, because accuracy now can prevent further tragedies in the future. We can't fix it if we don't know what happened. And there are 179 families that deserve to know the truth. As I mentioned, the aircraft in question, a 737-800, was originally built in 2009 and delivered to Ryanair and was operated by Ryanair until February of 2017 when it was transferred to JeJu Air. The FAA requires that both the CVR or combined CVR-FDR to have a backup power supply, providing power to these devices if the aircraft loses power. The requirement to have at least 10 minutes of electrical power to operate the CVR was added in 2008. As I mentioned before, Boeing's usual procedure is to comply with this on all orders, even those intended for international deliveries. However, as the aircraft was delivered to Ryanair, the jurisdiction fell outside the FAA. We did some research and discovered Ryanair falls under the Irish Aviation Authority and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, and both of these agencies adopted similar requirements that the FAA has, meaning the CVR at the least should have remained operational all the way through the attempted belly landing and impact with the concrete barrier, unless somewhere after being transferred to JeJu AIrlines, the system was changed by somebody. The CVR and FDR are both located in the tail of the aircraft, usually one on the left and one on the right side, which makes recovery easier for authorities. Our source indicated this accident reminded them of the Korean Air Flight 801 accident, which was a scheduled flight from Seoul to Guam that crashed on August 6, 1997, while attempting to land at Antonio B. Muan International Airport. The Boeing 747-300, carrying 254 people, struck a hillside approximately 3.3 miles from the runway. Of the 254 passengers and crew, 228 died. The accident was largely attributed to a combination of human error, miscommunication in the cockpit, and possibly cultural factors. The crew, particularly the captain, was under significant stress due to poor weather conditions and a lack of updated weather information. The captain, an experienced pilot, failed to properly adhere to standard approach procedures and ignored the warnings from the flight crew when they got too low. The first officer, despite concerns, did not challenge the captain's decisions, reflecting a hierarchical and deferential cockpit culture common in South Korea aviation at the time. This failure in communication and leadership ultimately contributed to the crash. The incident led to significant changes in Korean Air's training and cockpit communication practices, particularly emphasizing Crew Resource Management, CRM, which encourages open communication and questioning authority when necessary for safety. We spoke with our source and asked the question, could culture have played a role here? And they described South Korean culture as having a strong tie to obeying authority and respecting your elders. And through some research, we discovered that in the JeJu flight, the captain was 45 years old and a former Korean Air Force pilot, a common occurrence, according to our source, that most South Korean airline pilots come from the military. The first officer was only 35 years old and had substantially less experience than the captain, only 1,600 hours compared to the captain's 6,800 hours. And like the Korean Air Flight 801, did the first officer fail to question the captain? The cockpit voice recorder would give us this information. Under the FAA, airline pilots today are generally required to have 1,500 hours before flying either left seat or right seat. There are exceptions, and I'm not going to get into all that, but this 1,500-hour requirement for both pilots came after the 2009 Colgan air crash. Up to that point, only the captain was required to have the 1,500 hours. But that's the U.S., not everywhere else. A 1,600-hour first officer in the U.S. would mean someone who is brand new. In South Korea, he might have become a first officer with significantly fewer hours. The flight crew's names have still been withheld at this point. The accident has led to changes already being implemented by the South Korean government. Safety inspectors from the ARAIB identified 9 different airport locations around the country that had something within the safety zone of the runway, including several other concrete barriers. And all of these locations now will be addressed, removing the risk of this particular type of result to occur from a long landing. The government, in partnership with other low-cost carriers who fly in and out of South Korea, have agreed to reduce the number of flights each aircraft flies within a given period of time, giving more time for maintenance and inspections. But the biggest changes are the ones that need to come from the truth about what happened, and we need to know. We did ask our source whether they thought the investigation into the crash would be affected by the political instability that's currently present in South Korea, and they replied with maybe, reflecting on how the media plays a part in South Korea, often not addressing the facts and instead focusing on different aspects of a story to drive a narrative. Our South Korea source said that the media in South Korea was very quick after the crash to point the finger at Boeing. And if it was a mechanical issue, we need to know that so that we can fix it from happening again. But I hope that they can find the crucial final 4 minutes of the cockpit voice and flight data. No matter if it's embarrassing to one group or pulls back the curtain on deeper problems, it's critical to have the truth to be able to fix it. And I hope that they'll be able to do that. And that's my takeaway. Even in my own life, when I've done something wrong, I need to be accurate, to be truthful, to own it. And that's the only way that I can fix it. Thanks to our sponsors who make this channel possible, like Marshall Protective Services, MPSprotects.com, and the best glasses out there for under helmets and headsets, FlyingEyesOptics.com. Use our discount code, taking off all caps, one word, for 10% off. And please visit the links to all our sponsors in the description below. For our earlier report on the JeJu AIrlines crash, you can watch that right here. And remember, superior judgment trumps superior skills. Stay safe out there.